The live button.
Live stream.
Yeah, the live stream button.
Sure, sure.
Okay. It's now connecting. We should be live right now. Um, Hi everyone. Thank you for joining our live stream today with Sandeep. Or if you are watching this on YouTube after the live stream, thank you for joining us today. Would you like to introduce yourself, Sandeep?
Yeah, sure. Hey, Sam. So, Sandeep Garg, this side, and I'm a software tester. Uh, More than one decade in the software testing industry. I started my career as a bidder, a person who places the bid on the projects for the software companies. Moved into the development, stayed there for like 1 year, and then finally, somewhere around 2007, I moved fully into software testing space. Initial few years, I was not aware what real testing is. So I would say like 3 to 4 years, I was doing some kind of ad hoc or arbitrary kind of testing until I moved into understanding what real testing is. And after that, I did courses like BBST, Black Box Software Testing, Foundations course, and the Bug Advocacy. Then did RST Applied with James Bark. And yeah, this is where the learning journey started. And I'm pretty much happy with where I'm today, and still finding there are a lot of to learn in the software testing space.
Mm.
Uh, from the company standpoint, I worked with Fidelity, Pfizer, and these days I'm working with Bridge as a principal QA architect. That's slightly about me.
Cool. So you brought up the topic of what is real testing, and it took you a little while to understand behind that
Mhm.
sentiment. Do you mind going into that answer in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, sure. So when I started my career, I was
Did we lose? I think we lost audio. This is one of the challenges with trying to connect video feeds across countries. I'm based here in Sydney, Sandeep is based in India, and it seems that the internet is not necessarily playing nice today. What's happening? Can I stop? Well, unfortunately, we've just lost Sandeep. I will stop sharing my screen. How do I? Where is that? Where is that button? Oh, there we go. Hopefully, he can rejoin us very soon. But he was also talking about uh, BBST. Black box software testing is a course which is all online, was developed by Chimkana. I wonder if they've updated the slides recently. But there's a bunch of different courses that really explore the foundations of testing. I've heard these are really good courses. They've been on my backlog of things to cover at some point. We lost you for a bit there, Sandeep?
Yeah, yes. I lost my internet, but thankfully I have a backup with me, and it was ready.
Okay,
So
great. I
I just
was,
quickly came back.
yeah, just telling anyone who missed out um, uh, some of the terms that you brought up before were
Yes.
BBST and RST as well.
Okay, sure. So you brought up the topic real testing when I used the words real testing, right? So what I was saying was, when I started my career in testing, I was inclined writing test cases, right? Looking at the requirement documents, asking these things. I still remember an interview where I just remembered all the answers for different questions like what is smoke testing, what is sanity, and all that. And I was thinking that, wow, these are the important things. And at some point of time, they were really things that, as a if you are entering as a tester, you might be asked these kind of questions. But later on, when I explored, what is happening in the testing industry, right? And how can I become a better tester? Then I realized that there is something more than that. There's something more important than that, right? So never knew about the foundation of software testing, for example. How do they test? What is heuristics? What are oracles, right? So and then these opened my mind and beyond test cases. So as a person, I would say, so I realized that when I rebrand re start my journey of learning, I realized that beyond test cases, beyond requirement documents, we have to think better about it. So yeah, that's why I say the real testing career started somewhere around 2008, 9, I would say, something between that, when I looking into stuff very carefully, why we test, who matters, what is quality, and all these things. So that's why I'm saying few years, not real testing, but just maybe what James and Michael Bolton call, output checking, to be honest, right? Or checking. So I was doing that only. And I'm very honest about it because, yeah, this is what I did. But yeah,
Yeah, I think today I'd like to focus this pairing session on how
sure.
to go about learning new things in the software testing space. So if anyone's got any questions, you're more than welcome to pop them in the chat and I'll shoot them Sandeep's way. Unfortunately, I didn't do a huge amount of promotion of this beforehand, so we may not get a huge live audience, but we should at least get some engagement when we repost this on YouTube 24 hours after the live stream.
Yeah, sure.
So, can you walk us through how you discovered these other learning resources? How did you go from that outbox checking type of tester to that critical thinking type of tester?
Okay. Uh, so when I was doing this output checking, even that kind of stuff, once I was playing with the template of test cases, right? And I was doing some experiments. Okay, why cannot we do this? Why cannot we link the tabs and all these things? I did that, and I presented to my peer and say, "Hey, can we do this way?" And the responses was like, "No, this has to be done this way only." And I was like, "That should not be a mandate. Something has to change here, right? Or we can experiment with these templates itself, right? They are not hard and fast rules to do something." And yeah, and this is where I started doing, exploring this stuff, right? I came into contact with developers. I started learning the products, and there was one product we were testing. There was no specifications. We just promised to the client, based on my business analyst understanding, that we can build a product which is available in the market, a replica of that, right? We started on that project, and we we asked for the requirement documents, and the manager said it's not there, right? So we thought, how can we learn that? And if I remember, that was a poker game, right? So we started understanding what is poker game, how it is played, what are the tournaments, what are single games. We started learning on the YouTube, right? And this is where understanding started. What is a product, why it is used, what users does here, right? And how they play, what are different terminologies. So that was one starting point where I turned into, from a requirement document based testing person to a person who wants to understand the product, right? But still, that was more, a linear journey, understanding the product, then go back and start testing, and then come back. There was no structure as such, right? So as I further explored the world, and I started looking into that stuff. So I would say that, it's continuous exploration. You pick one point, and then you look at it, and then you go back, you apply in your testing assignments, and then you find out, okay, there is something more to learn. So this is how I started.
That's like often it's the case that testers get landed on projects and there's no requirements. And if
Yes,
testers
yes.
say, you know, the point of testing is to check that the requirements are met, which is not necessarily a great answer for that that question, why do we even bother testing? But at least it's a start. And a lot of people think that the role of testing is to either find bugs or check the requirements. And I think there's a bit more to why we bother
Yes, yes, you're
testing.
right. There is more to that. These are just, you know, if testing is a superset, right, of activities and thinking and exploration, these are some elements of that. So definitely you have to check what's going on, right? So you have to check if the even if these are documented requirements, let's say, they because requirements are documented in some way or other, right? It need not to be have a proper, or a formal templates, right? Requirement specification documents. And recently I was reading structured analysis and design from Tom DeMarco, in which he beautifully mentioned that uh, from the analysis of any product or business needs, there can be a product, there could be a uh, outcome which could be called specification document, requirement document, or he gave a very generic name to that called target document, right? So this is your target document. You call it specification document, requirement, or SRS or BRS or BRDs. That could be some organization specific or contextual naming convention, but ultimately this is your analysis. What is the problem statement? What is you think that your solution could look like based on the analysis, and then you put it somewhere. For example, you might be preparing a mind map, right? So that could be a target document from our conversation analysis, right? And then you use that to distribute among the people and say, okay, this is what we analyzed. Let's start thinking about it. Let's start talking about it and develop something that delivers value to the customer. So yeah, that's with respect to the documentation and all that stuff.
In terms of resources for learning new things, you're connected with the Test Tribe, and they have a library of testing resources. So, do you mind telling us a bit about how you got involved with the Test Tribe, what they do, and how they support the community?
Yeah, sure. um, so back in 2008, I still remember that, when the test drive started in January. uh, so we are like celebrating 4 years this January in 2022. So back in 2018, I was in a workshop in Bangalore, India, and I came back from the workshop. And since I like writing, but not very consistent, as you can see on my blog, that I did one stuff and then moved to another one, and then it was blocked somehow. It revoked my access somehow, and I came back to the old blog. So, in a nutshell, I love writing to some extent, and there are a lot of things that are unpublished that are in my diaries or in my notepads. So I was coming from a workshop and I posted something, and they found it. They were like, "Oh, there is someone who is posting about our workshops, right?" So this is how we got connected with the founders, and I joined as a volunteer. And okay, I can do your workshops of offline meetups in Bangalore, uh, hackathons, and all this stuff. So I still love volunteering, and I uh, exploring that area as well. I'm exploring that area because how do you what motivates you to become a volunteer, right? uh, are there, though we usually say that that's very altruistic way of serving the community or serving the people, but I believe and I know that there are some personal benefits as well. There are some personal motivations as well to become a volunteer. For example, learning, networking, experience to different activities, right? So this is how I connected with the test tribe. 4 year journey, very good so far. And last year we do the test drive 2.0, in which we overhauled our website and initiated different programs. So library of testing is one initiative out of them. So yeah, so we are adding the resources which we properly scan We see, okay, these are the credible resources to be added, not just everything, right? And then
Mm,
we start doing that and continue will be doing that in future.
mm. Yeah, I just clicked on the mobile testing tab, and there is a link to a introduction section. And so
Hmm.
that links you to a bunch of resources that are fairly well regarded in the general community. The first link that comes up in that page is testing on emulators versus simulators versus real devices from Browser Stack and Source Labs. These are all big players in the mobile testing space, and they have tons of tools that. So these are companies who have published tools to help with mobile testing. So it's like, yeah, at the end of the day, these companies are trying to make money from developing these tools, but they also need to. They often create really good learning resources for how to explore some of these areas too.
Yes.
In terms of what you are trying to learn at the moment, is there anything on your radar that you're trying to explore?
uh, Multiple things. It's not one only in one direction. So as we talked about that, testing is as a superset contains a lot of things, right? So you have, as a tester, as a learning tester, you have to focus on your communication. You have to focus on uh, how you understand who the users are, what they do, how they do these things, right? So you have to look at the multiple spectrum, a spectrum of different products available.
Mm.
You talk about web applications, you talk about mobile applications, you talk about enterprise applications, you talk about APIs, you talk about monolithic application, the microservices. So there's a lot, from the technology, technical communication, and from a user perspective, right? Systems perspective, for example, system thinking is one of the area which you know fascinate me more than anything, right? So I read a lot on system thinking, how it is done. Leadership, for example, right? So in general, what the leadership is, what testing leadership is. So there are different directions. I move at the same time, crawling like a spider, and just getting stuff from here and there. So not in one direction particularly. There are some areas definitely. For example, I'm doing a JMeter workshop uh, on 12th of February, right? So that I thought, after spending like 1 or 2 years in different frequency and different amplitudes, and I decided, okay, why not to share my learning journey with the people, right? And probably give them the resources that they from where they can get the real understanding of what load testing is, because I failed several times and I realized that this is something I can share with the people, right? So
Yep. Oh, I'm just resetting up, rejiggering around some pictures and stuff. Um,
sure.
just so I can share my screen with, come back to sharing my screen with you, but also make sure that I'm not double sharing my screen with anyone who's watching this live. Where's that picture? There we go. Have you heard of K6 for performance testing?
Yes, I heard about it first 2 years back, and we were trying to understand, okay, if there's some alternative to JMeter,
Mm.
and then we came up to know with about the K6, right? And even in organizations who have the huge presence on the web and mass consumer centric applications, I've talked to people and they have successfully used K6 from the beginning of the life software development life cycle, right? And I think this is where they talk about CI/CD pipeline and using K6 into every build, checking and going through the performance checks.
Yeah, that's one of the issues with JMeter is that also with Selenium as well. These technologies that were built to help test web were developed 10, 15 years ago when web was
Mhm.
still fairly new. But a lot of the technologies that we now use for testing were underdeveloped. You didn't have continuous testing, build pipelines, and a whole bunch of jazz. So I've heard that a lot of teams struggle today to fit some of these more established tools and practices in a
Mhm.
more continuous testing approach. I've heard it's one of the biggest pain points with using Selenium tests is how do you put them in a continuous testing How do you get the feedback to feed into builds? How do you get people to pay attention to failing tests? Because no matter how much automation you build, there's always going to be failing tests because things are constantly changing. And so trying to get that buy-in on teams to help address builds and to pay attention to that feedback, I think is a big challenge with some of these tools. Um,
Right.
at the
Mm.
moment, I'm the client I'm working with. I'm doing a performance testing spike, and just doing a
Oh,
spike using K6. And eventually, we should get to a point where we can incorporate it into some of our build pipelines. But it was surprisingly easy to get started. I do plan on creating some blogs and some learning material once I've solidified some of my learning. There's also a bunch of helper scripts that have been created by the community. So, for example, if you've got a Postman collection of all of your
hmm,
APIs, there
hmm.
is a script you can run that will convert that Postman collection into a K6 performance testing script as well.
Yep. Yep.
So
Yep.
it
I did
seems.
an equivalent activity with last year, I guess, with JMeter, right? And I'm not focusing on very much on tool. I'm just, based on your scripting that converts Postman collection into, the equivalent version of JMeter scripts. I did that. I'm just saying from a actionable stuff perspective.
Mm,
But yes, I guess, and again, based on the experience, right? Very because context varies, right? I come from a banking background when I tested a lot of banking applications, huge applications, legacy, right, where the product consolidations are happening, and new applications are being built. So there were separate departments for they call NFEs, non-performance engineering, right, or
mm,
non-functional engineering, right? NFE basically we call non-functional engineering, where you take care of security and performance. And basically, as a tester, I was not involved much into okay, let me look into the performance aspects of it, right? And you brought a very good point, which I still, I would say, looking into that area to learn, which is continuous testing, right? So I hear about it a lot, and we are getting into that space. So how do you, how would you like to explain what continuous testing is, and what progression you see in the industry and your experience with that?
mm.
How would you explain? Yep.
Um, I guess, well, the active testing is to get feedback on the state of the product to help us
Hmm.
answer the question, are we comfortable shipping this new software to our existing customers or to new customers or to do whatever else it is to help us achieve more business success, whether that's more sales, happier customers, or a whole bunch of jazz. Though, if we're sitting here and exploring every single code change, that takes quite a large amount of time. And we've now got development teams who are moving towards a continuous testing, continuous integration. There's a lot of terminology that's used in that space that's often
Hmm.
acronized or acronymed as CICD. There's a huge difference between continuous integration and continuous testing um, compared to continuous deployment. I
Deploy.
think a lot of I've seen in the industry that a lot of engineering teams are trying to move towards continuous deployment. I have a similar background as you, Sandeep, that big finance companies, and it's almost as if working in finance, there's a lot more money when it comes to making sure that the product is working and is
Functioning
thoroughly
well at least,
tested.
Yep.
Yeah, but unfortunately, in some of those bigger corporates, they call things like performance testing and security testing as non-functional requirements. But I don't know about you. As a user, if I'm using a website and it's very slow and it's not performing, and there looks like there's security issues, you're not going to trust it, right?
Right.
So how do
Agree.
we change that mindset in companies that these elements of quality are actually functional requirements users care about? They're not. It's not like they're non-functional. Your
Right.
website is non-functioning if it doesn't perform to a certain
It's
expectation.
exactly. And I think you did it. you raised a very good point here, I would say, because as you mentioned that you came from the similar background of finance, right? And their way of thinking and how we build our way of thinking, right? Because the moment you say, "Oh, Sandeep, stop! This is non-functional stuff," so do not come to this area, right? It's something specialized area because of the scale, right? So you need a different specialization, right? Or building the new skills into the performance testing, the enterprise applications. So you need to know, for example, like queuing theory, right? You need to understand because what I realized is in banking applications which are non-consumer centric, like B2B applications, right? There are no consumers, right? The consumers are basically the APIs or third-party applications, right?
Mm.
So in that case, the way I built my own mental model was okay, there is no user, right? So there is no website, right? It's just the back office operations, right? So let's say your payments are moving from one place to another, right? So there is no user as such. What where the user is from the initiating application and the target application, right? In between, what is happening in the entire banking infrastructure at different places, right? In even different banks where the payments are moving, for example, you don't worry about it, right? So we tester eventually build our own mental model. Oh, maybe performance is not something I should take care of because it's huge learning area, right? And then when we come to the web space where applications are more consumer centric, right? We talk about user experience, performance, oh, security. So I would say as tester, we also have to change our own mental models about it, right? Our own perception on how now we are going to see performance implications, right? And then connecting that back to say, okay, Sam, uh, website is not performing, and Sam says or Sandeep says, well, yeah, that's a non-functional area. We are testing, we are functional testers, for example, right? So this is non-functional area,
Not my
and then
problem.
I and then I can say, as you mentioned, well, if it is not performing and I have to wait for a long time, it for me it's not functioning, right? Or if my data is lost, right, because of those poor performance or data is corrupted, let's say, or my credentials are being shared openly, right? So even if it's functioning, right, even if I'm doing some job doing that web application, it doesn't matter. I'm leaving, right? Because
Mm.
you're not taking care of my safety, right?
Yeah.
So even if it was functioning, it's not work. It's not good for me to use this anymore,
Yeah. So
right?
anyone
So
who's watching this video, I try to challenge you to change your thinking about non-functional requirements because to your users, it doesn't matter. It's still
yes,
not functioning.
exactly. Or if it isn't functioning, it's not useful, right? Because you're you're not taking care of my credentials. You're making them open, public. My data privacy is gone, right?
Mm.
So even if you have a login, beautiful UX, if my credentials are traveling on the wire unsafe, so what to do about it? I'm leaving.
In
That's
terms
a good point.
Oh yeah,
That's a
in
good point.
terms of continuous testing, I was looking through your GitHub repository and you had checked
Mhm.
out a pipeline project that was run by Ministry of Testing. So a
Yes.
99-minute workshop on building the basics with CICD. Do you remember much from that workshop? Was it useful?
I guess it was useful, and as I told you that it takes time to go into that direction, right? So I believe, to be honest, that I just looked at it once or twice, and then I did nothing much as such in that direction,
Mm.
right? So that's an honest answer, I would like to say.
I would say like learning new things is hard and it can be daunting and it doesn't necessarily matter if you sign up for all the online workshops. I don't know how many online courses I've signed up for and have never finished.
I can understand that. I can
I
understand.
don't know if anyone else who's watching this has had more success with self learning and staying focused. But I find I need to have people to interact with to make the learning useful. It has to be tangible. I have to have a reason that is generally work related why I'm learning this new project, other than just
Mhm.
it might be good for my career.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think beyond work, because you know, when we read resume, for example, right? In India, especially, we write about, okay, we want a challenging environment, right? And so I remember one blog post saying, why can't you work in a non-challenging environment, right? Why can't you work in a boring environment, right? So I'm just trying to make an analogy between, work, between work and, environments, right? So the workplace sometimes may not have that kind of, learning opportunity, right? They may be working on legacy product. There is no CI/CD pipelines. I, and as you come from a banking background, you know that there are still products, running on mainframes,
Yes,
right?
my previous
People have made,
project was a mainframe project. It's hard to get the mainframe into an
yeah, the
online
green
VM.
screen,
Yep,
the green screen, right?
yep.
So now look at it from a testing standpoint, right? You still learn the entire application, right? You still go into, the mainframes, right? And you say, okay, how one transaction entered into a mainframe screen, remembering those commands, right? You move that entire transaction, which is reflecting on a fantastic GUI, right? You see the change in the perspective and the context, right? From a green screen, you run the commands and you see everything on a GUI, right? And I did printer testing as well, right? So in banks, you have some different ATM and all the teller machines. They,
Mm.
they call tellers in US, I guess, right? So I was like, what is a teller? And I searched for that. Okay, well, teller is a person. Actually, was a person in the bank, sitting in the bank and serving to the customers, right? And so I did printer testing as well. So the entire integration test of how the transaction entered and how a receipt is coming out from the printer itself. It's tiny printers. But then, could I do CI/CD in that environment? Maybe not. But does it stop me from learning? Maybe, if I'm not exposed to the world outside. If I'm confined into that mainframe world and I'm saying, okay, I'm content, I'm happy, I know the banking applications, and I could be a business rule person. I could be a person who knows, okay, how on this mainframe infrastructure, how your entire PCI DSS compliance running. I could be a fantastic security tester, nothing to do with CI/CD pipeline at that moment, right? But when they change, then you cannot blame anyone. Then you can only blame yourself, saying, "Oh, why did not I think of what's actually going on in the real world, which is, for example, CI/CD, right?"
Mm.
So no matter how successful it is, to be honest, because I'm not much familiar to, right? But again, this is a reality, and you have to have some taste to learn that reality, or at least go into that area and try to find what's happening.
So yeah, I
What are the
guess
basics?
along those sentiments, you say like it's easy to feel comfortable if you're like in that legacy type of system, you're testing printers on mainframes, and it's like, I know what I'm doing, I'm comfortable. How do you find time then to um, prioritize learning things outside of your comfort zone?
Hmm. We have
How
to
do you
make
find
time.
time for learning?
We have to make time is limited. We know that there are 24 hours in a
Mm,
day, right? So we have to make it, right? For example, I woke up early morning today. I set up my laptops, I prepared my backups because I wanted to invest 1 hour like this in my learning,
mm.
right? I came with an open mind. I did not know what we are going to test, how we are going to pair, and then you surprised me with an email. Hey, can you look at this text set of 15 minutes and all that? And that was learning number one for the day. That if someday I do these kind of sessions, oh, I remember heuristic from Sam. Make person comfortable. Hey, I'm here. I'm setting up. You should also be prepared. It's kind of implicit message, right? That you also start getting ready. Just don't say, uh, 6 a.m. Hi Sam, how are you? Right? Not like that. So we have to make time for learning. And if we don't make it, then we should be ready for the consequences.
Mm.
Unless you are very much lucky, unless your mainframe systems are going for decades, right? Or at least 10 to 20 years more, it's okay. I mean, it's a choice, I would say. Learning is largely a choice, but in this today's knowledge ecosystem, thinking about, well, not learning is going to help, I can comment on that, to be honest, because it didn't work for me.
Yeah.
It
Um,
didn't work for me.
I think I'd like to make an analogy that when we talk to a doctor or an accountant or some other professional, and they're certified, they're chartered. Um, part of Part of how they maintain their license is they have to dedicate, maybe 30, 50 hours a year for professional development. We don't have the same enforcement in software development and testing. Um, However, um, I'm part of a membership in Australia called the Australian Computing Society, and I am a chartered professional in that situation, mostly because I get really good professional indemnity insurance for my own consulting.
Yes.
So I'm only doing that really for cheap insurance. But to maintain that chartered status, I need to note down 30 hours of professional development over the year. The thing is, if I do one of these sessions a week, um, over the whole year, that's my professional development done. So it's really
Right,
just
right,
45 minutes of learning every week. The act of reading
right.
blogs or writing blogs or attending a conference, an easy way to get that professional development is to that 30 hours is to attend a 2 day workshop, because there's 16 hours of professional development.
Profession. Okay, okay. Yeah, that's one perspective to looking into, how you do your professional development and what activities actually contributing to that, right?
Volunteering counts towards that too. If you're helping a
Volunteering.
local meetup group or helping maintain a community website, all of that time can count towards your professional development. You don't have to feel guilty for. I found like it was easy to feel like, oh, I'm not learning enough. There is so much technology out there. How can I ever learn it all? And it's like, nah, give up on that. You can never learn everything. Um,
Yes.
but you can still focus on areas that interest you, prioritize working on just one thing rather than 50 and never doing any of it.
Right, right. I mean, it's more about targeted learning, right? So, for example, testability. I'm focusing on testability these days, right? Which is I never thought seriously until for last couple of years, and then I'm reading books and blogs on that, and trying to make sense of it, and how can I use it in my day-to-day testing stuff, right?
Cool. Uh,
Sometimes we got availability because we are familiar with the product. We know in and out. Okay, this is an API ecosystem, this is GUI, this is database. So we know how to interact with the application in different ways, and we make our own mental model of, oh, this is how it is testable, right, in different ways. But what if we start thinking in terms of, when we coming to test the software, we think explicitly about testability, and we start asking questions like, okay, who are our users, how they use it, and have we built testability into that?
what does
Or maybe
testability
asking,
mean to you?
to me, testability means how easily we can test an application. So are the provisions made while the application development was happening? Were the provisions made to make that application able to be tested easily by the testing team and the other person on the team, right?
Mm,
So, for example, let's say mobile application, right? So I think there is an intrinsic testability made when you do testing using emulators and simulators. So the application can be launched on that, right? So now you know that, okay, emulators and simulators can be used, right? How many are ways, to test the business logic, maybe through the APIs, right?
mm,
So you don't rely on one thing, but you also know that there are easy way to do that, right? So when you're testing, let's say I worked on an application which was on the NoSQL database, right?
yeah.
I mean, non-relational, right? So uh, when you work on relational database management systems or relational database, you have a mental model of, oh yes, this table is related to this, and all that stuff, right? So you can, for example, you can create the diagrams, right? And you can easily look into the relationships, right? But when it comes to NoSQL, there is no relationship, right? There are different, whatever the format in which you have stored your entities, right? So it could be JSON, right? So then how do you make sense? Are you reading the JSON files and understanding those? So I asked for a testability. I said, okay, if I'm going to test it within the time that you're given to me, help me, right? Build something for me, or allow me to build something that basically, if not, it, it gives me a visibility into how the data is related, right? So we did some coding in C sharp, and then we built a tool. It took like 2 weeks. But if I haven't asked for it, right, it was like, well, you know what to test, how to test. So, right. But then I raised that, okay, I cannot test efficiently if I'm not getting testability aspect built into it.
And that's a huge, that's a great segue back into CICD. Continuous integration focuses on enhancing testability. Often that comes out in software engineering as breaking modules down into small, independent little bits of code that you can, compile locally, that you can test without having a fully integrated test environment. If you can test a small component in isolation, you increase the testability. If you're able to build in a couple of hooks or some tools that make it easier to poke and prod on the internals, you increase the testability and it makes it easier to incorporate into those pipelines further down as well. So there's a lot of software engineering practices that can go into testability. I was working with one client, which was a big, giant mobile app. Think it was developed by or maintained by 50 to 100 developers based all over the world and lots of different components. So very
Mhm.
complex mobile app. One of the ones that comes pre-installed on the Android operating system. I can't say officially what who my client was because this is recorded. But uh, one of those big giant companies.
Okay.
And they built this Android app in such a way that the modules could be built independently. You didn't have to build the whole entire app to be able to test just a small component. You didn't need to have a completely dedicated end-to-end test environment to be able to test small
Mhm.
features. And so it was like an interesting experience.
Mhm. So, uh, just a follow-up question on this. So, when you say end-to-end test environment, do you mean that? And when you say module, I mean, you say module in generic way, or module in terms of the Android environment specific?
The modules were based up on functionality. So if you've got a mobile app that does 5 different things,
Hmm.
and they're fairly independent tasks, you can
Okay.
you can structure the software such that you have like a core part. So maybe you have like your core Android APIs, um,
Hmm. Okay. Mhm.
but then a module can be built independent of that. And so like a full-on dedicated end-to-end test environment is when you've got APIs that are returning real responses, or you've got you're actually talking to dedicated infrastructure. Um, though the definition of an end-to-end test environment is quite complex, and
Hmm.
there's always different variations. Um, One, I guess, movement I've seen in the API testing space, particularly
Hmm.
if you're moving towards a microservice architecture, which again comes
Hmm.
back to this testability. It's breaking your big, giant, monolithic piece of software into smaller components, so it's easier to
Yes.
test, easier to deploy, and whatnot. So if you've got two microservices and they talk to each other via an API, you can, instead of making sure that when you want to test them, if they are deployed to a test environment, and then you can test that microservice A actually talks to microservice B. You can actually implement something called contract-based testing, or PACT, or I've seen this is making traction, so that the first microservice writes a contract. It's like, when I hit this other service, this other API, I expect JSON in this format. For me to work and for me to do my thing, I need this contract met. And so instead of
Okay.
testing that in a test environment, um, that microservice can publish its contract. And so the next time this service is built and tested, it pulls down that contract from a local server or from a shared server, executes it against itself, and it's like, yes, I can still make this contract. I can still talk to microservice A. So
Mm.
you can actually decouple that end-to-end integrated testing, or at least that checking, such that that testing can be run during a build pipeline phase and can be completely decoupled from a system integration or end-to-end test environment.
Okay. One follow-up question, one more, right? Because we talked about the contract. Uh, Before the web APIs, I mean, not before web, but when I was not looking into web API space a few years back, there were XML schemas, right? XSDs and all that stuff, right?
Mm.
Uh, do you think that these contracts are like lighter versions of those XSD schemas and all that? They were in XML, but these are in just JSONs,
Mm.
something like that. Are these the same, similar, or what do
I
you think?
imagine I'm assuming they are quite similar. I think some of the problems, or correct me if I'm wrong, with using XML data for API responses was that anyone could create any structure. And like, you still have that problem with JSON. Serializing and deserializing JSON is probably one of the biggest problems with using a JSON structure. I think it's just
Okay.
not as flexible. So when you've got an XML response, I guess for anyone who's unaware, XML is some sort of markup language, kind of like HTML that renders your page is kind of similar, but a bunch of tags, open tags, close tags, and
Yes.
that's how
Yes.
your data structure is. I wonder if I can
There
get
was
an
a structure. There was a structure, right? So
yeah,
it
sample
it was
sample.
not. Yeah, it was not auto healing like HTML. If your tag is missing, so it auto heals, for example, render in a light in a way that it's not distracted. But XML required those end, closing, parent, child nodes, and all that stuff. And then if you have prepared a web service based on particular schema, right? You
Mm,
all the time you make a change, you have to publish it, right?
mm,
And if you don't publish and the client don't understand, the communication fails,
mm,
right? It doesn't do something, right? And that was heavy weight. And I mean, as far as my study is concerned, when I was like, hey, what's the difference between a web API and this XML stuff? So largely what I got to know is that, uh, correct me if I'm wrong, but the the biggest answer I heard was, okay, if your applications are very contract heavy, contractuals, you are integrating your web services with third parties, there are compliance requirements, use web services, right? But if these consumer centric applications, you want like lightweight application, mobile applications to be built, don't use web services because these are heavy. So for me, the difference was, okay, this is heavy, this is lightweight. There is a language difference or the object difference, like it's XML, it is JSON, and it is flexible, it is not that much flexible. These three answers I had, right?
mm.
So, but when I heard about contract, I was like, oh, are we moving back to that, paradigm, but with a lightweight technology usage like JSON objects? So that I was thinking. That's why I asked the question.
Yeah, it's a way of like building in that schema checking. Um, Actually, I think that's a good analogy. It's like checking the schema is a valid data structure that can support that communication.
Yes, I guess so.
I think in one of the other issues with the using the XML schemas. I think you mentioned that it was very easy to introduce backwards compatibility issues. If an API is updated and you don't also update the downstream services, things just break more often.
In
This
just like yes.
this still happens with JSON-based APIs, but it can be if you're trying to restructure the data structure in an API, you can like just add extra objects down at the bottom or in a section where other downstream APIs don't necessarily care about. Um, and so, as a benefit in like mobile app development, when you release a mobile app, you can't force everyone to update every single time. You actually have like 5 to 10 different supported app versions, particularly if you're releasing a new app version every 2 weeks. You can have, 10 or 15 different app versions that have to be supported in production.
Hmm.
Um, and if you were using XML based APIs and were introducing some new data in a new API, you would break all of those supported versions when you deployed your backend API. Um, so I find mobile teams tend to consider things like backwards compatibility slightly more so than web developers. Because with web development, you can deploy your client and your backend at the exact same time. Um, you don't have to manage, uh, or you still have to manage all the different browsers and the considerations with how they might render different responses that come back from the server. Um, but you don't have to actively manage 15 different versions of all of your different clients.
Hmm. Okay. All right. Makes sense. And
I
how
think,
CICD helps in for example, you mentioned like 5 different versions of a mobile app, right? Um, so how you deal with testing in a CI/CD environment? Or do you build different pipelines for each version? How does it work usually?
yeah, so I guess the supporting different versions through CICD can be a challenge.
Mm-hmm,
Um, if we're taking that example of that mobile app team and trying to support 15 different versions, one way to build in that type of version testing is when you have your build pipeline publish a file. It's like, yeah, this mobile app version is built. That generates a file, an APK or an IPA, depending on Android or iOS, and so you can build
mm-hmm,
then another service that pulls down that version, or maybe has a collection of all the existing supported versions, and then can execute maybe like a really basic sanity test once every week or two.
mm,
So um, against a back end service. So um, this was something we were going to explore in a previous team, but I moved on before we were able to build it out. But the main thing we wanted to help answer the question is, does our current API in development talk to every supported mobile app version? And so we originally built these in Java and we were using Appium. I don't like using Appium. Uh,
mm-hmm,
there's lots of other mobile technology tools. Um, but yes, the general premise was we just wanted to check. We didn't want to do really thorough regression testing with every single build. We just wanted to check if the app can talk to the API. So that build would only go to the screens that called the API and just check
mm-hmm.
that the page rendered, that it loaded,
Page
it
traffic.
that
Mm-hmm.
it
Okay.
didn't error out.
Okay. Okay.
So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and then like you also one of the problems with CICD is how do you present that information and how do you get people to respond to that information? Um, some of the better testing tools maybe they come with their own dashboards. For example, K6 comes with an output you can output to the terminal as a UI, or you could output a HTML page which you can render the test results. I
Mm,
kind of feel like how do you pay attention to build results, because I I think it's easy to build a pipeline and to get tests working and to go, yep, that's all cool now. Um, but how do you feed that feedback in such that it people actually care when that build starts failing, so that they can respond in a timely manner? I
Hmm.
think a problem that a lot of testers tend to face is they'll build out a bunch of automation tests, and then 3 months, 6 months down the track, they're like, oh shit, now I have to maintain these because no one else cares. None of the developers are paying attention. They're not helping me, and this is now a huge time sink. And it's like, where's the value in that situation?
Hmm. So, and again, we can, every topic we are discussing is going to other topic, interesting topic, right? And maybe beyond discussions, we start someday, thinking about the solutions, right? So, for example, as a tester, if I write my automation scripts, as you mentioned, which are failing and nobody cares, and if I empathize with my developer team, I would be saying, oh, their unit test might also be failing. So, are they expecting the similar thing from me, right? That okay, can Sandeep help me in correcting my unit tests, right? So how do we see this support problem? I mean, if I try to label that problem as a mutual support or mutual expectations problem, right? And how soon can we resolve that? What can we do about it, right? Because we often talk about it. Hey, your unit testing should be done fantastically, right? Sometimes I say in my teams, right? if your if my application, our application, basically it's our application until it goes to the client, right, who is paying us for developing and doing all that stuff. As long as inside the organization it is the app that we have to take care of, right? And we say, okay, please write better unit tests, right? We expect from you, right? But on what premise our expectations is based on, right? Because writing good unit tests, yes, one thing, because I want my team to deliver a product that challenge me as a tester, right? Okay, we have done the basic stuff. Now you show your skills, find something, right, that we have not tested at unit level, right? This is where our journey starts. And then we write, let's say, for example, automation scripts, right? And that gets failing. But at the same time, it means that something is building into the product, right? It may be right or wrong at some place, but it's building up. So how we deal with that problem? How can we support our developers as well? I'm thinking that way, just
Mm.
because this automation scripts failure topic triggered, right?
I think it's a huge topic that can be discussed
Yes.
in a
Just
huge amount of detail, like how to collaborate with teams of
how.
developers, especially when you've got different team structures, and I think that a lot of testers struggle in that, um, and it can be really hard to bridge that gap between how do we as devs and testers, how do we help each other, because we both want to deliver quality products that we can be proud of, but sometimes
Hmm,
it can just be a bit hard to bridge that gap, right?
right. And that brings other topic. We talk about these days, okay, work in Scrum frameworks and iterated deliveries in agile frameworks, right? So uh, the question is, when it comes to Scrum, for example, right, they talk about cross-functional teams, right? And in cross-functional team, there are specialists, but the premise is that they help each other by doing, stuff that add value to each other's jobs day to day, right? So that would bring other topic, to how to become reasonably cross-functional, right?
Mm,
Within the scope of the specialities.
exactly. um I'm conscious of time. Unfortunately, we didn't get into a lot of actual testing today, but it was a really good discussion. I really enjoyed having this pairing session with you today, Sandeep.
Same here, and yeah, I mean, we reached. Oh, yeah, it's 7, right? So we reached to the limits. And I was looking at K6 right now. Let me explore it. How is it? And just I mean, if you have some time to just have few more discussion around um, the K6 journey, have you started it or you're starting it, or how do you find it? Because when a tool come to the market, right, we do some, proof of concept, and then we start some stuff going into that direction. So, I mean, if I may ask you, where are you right now on that journey? Is it done? You're like, oh, fantastic, POC done. Some initial product has been tested, and where are you right now?
I think with K6, probably in terms of that, it's more of that proof of concept. I'd
Okay,
say I've been able to demonstrate how to import some APIs, how to set up some sort of load or schedule. I haven't really tested an application with a particular load that we're expecting. So that's my next step, is to
okay,
actually figure out how to um, cascade a couple of APIs. So currently my script is, it's like I've got two APIs that I'm testing, but one of them
hmm,
needs to have some extra data from another API. So it needs to have a request
okay,
ID feed in. So when I run the
hmm,
current test, it's like the first one's just a health check. It's all passing. But the second one fails, doesn't return a 200 response, because I need more. I need to get
mm,
more data from another API.
okay, okay,
But
all
from
right,
looking at the tutorials, that the documentation that K6 has, they actually
hmm,
have a an example of running um, the exact same type of test. I can't find it at the moment, but
hmm,
um, because cascading APIs is a very common problem to come into. So often you'll have to authenticate against an API, generate a JWT token or some other token, and then use
some other
that
thing.
token with further down APIs. So you need to figure out how to do a setup script before you run your performance testing script. It's like, hey, go do authentication, get the API, store it in a variable, and then use that for further downstream APIs. That's kind of where I'm at the moment. But K6, the documentation, they've already got an example of how they do that with some other test APIs as well. So, in terms of my progress, it's like I'm really impressed with the documentation and the community behind K6.
Hmm.
Because I remember we had to do the exact same thing with JMeter, and the developer had to write basically our own little helper function inside JMeter to be able
Okay,
to reverse engineer the authentication that we had built in. Because
okay,
the way we did signatures, I think for the mobile team, again, this was a banking platform. We basically re-implemented our own uh, uh, I'm a bit lost for words. We had to we basically authentication on mobile wasn't as mature as it was on mobile. We had to basically implement our own hashing function. So
okay.
usually caveat: never build your own hashing function, um,
Hmm.
because you are more likely to screw it up compared to the professionals that have dedicated all of their life to do it. We had to do it
Hmm.
for mobile because there wasn't a library available to help do our own hashing.
Mm. Okay,
So
okay.
we had to build another helper function in our JMeter function, which is basically reverse engineering that hashing function so that we could do performance testing of mobile backend APIs. Um,
Interesting. Hmm.
so it was that act of authenticating and then using downstream APIs was a real challenge in JMeter. And I'm trying to do like almost the same thing now in K6, and K6 have easy documentation in how to do exactly that.
Okay, that's an interesting problem I heard, in terms of a token which is hashed, you mean to say?
Something like that. There was some salting
Something
and
like that.
some
Okay.
hashing and some
Okay.
my security knowledge is a little bit rusty, and I'm getting the terminology all mixed up. Um,
Okay, yeah, that happens. Sometimes it happens. It's okay. It's totally understandable.
yeah, I think
And
it
so,
was yeah, it was just how we encrypted the data. We had
okay,
to
okay,
use build our own little.
I
Um,
I get it. I get it. Just another question. So when you started your journey into this K6, right? So did you start with the CI/CD into mind, or it was just migration from some other load testing tool to K6? I mean, there are two perspectives, right? Okay, first I learned K6, and then I go back to do it in CI/CD, right?
mm,
Other is let me understand CI/CD where it fits, and then we, integrate that into part. So,
um, yeah, my journey into K6 was not Let's Test. It was I was actually doing some API testing, building out a framework for TypeScript. So with TypeScript and you've got API testing, there's I think a tool called Supertest, where you can flesh out. I've got a blog post on how I got started with API testing. Unfortunately, my blog is down at the moment, and I haven't had time to fix it. Or else I
okay.
would chuck it up as a reference. But we started doing event-based testing and API testing in our own test harness. Um, because we were using an event queue system. So sometimes with uh, services, you have not just the API, but you also have data coming in and going out through events as well.
Yep, yep.
So we were just looking at a way to combine that. And then the next step was like, can we use this framework that we've already built to do stuff like performance testing? And it turns out that it was pretty straightforward. I did a spike, a proof of concept, blogged about that journey, shared that
Oh,
with the consulting team that I'm now a network of. And they're like, oh, if you're interested in performance testing, you should check out K6. And so
mhm,
now I'm on a new client and they don't really have any performance testing, but a developer on the team has used K6 before to do some production performance testing. It's like, oh,
mhm.
great, this is already a tool that people have explored. I'll do another proof of concept, do a bit more documentation, and do a bit of learning that way.
Great.
So it
And I
was more
see
because I
there's
was
a,
doing API testing and doing a framework for
I
that, and I wanted to add performance testing on top of that. And then someone suggested doing some investigation into K6.
get it, get it, get it. Yeah, this is how we start. At some place we start. Some people start from load testing first, then thinking of API and the web interface and how to combine and look at the overall user experience. People like me and you, for example, come from the API, maybe, and say, okay, this is the API, let load test that, right? So different, starting points in this journey, right?
Mm,
And interesting to see the load testing manifesto on the K6 documentation. That's interesting to read. Load testing manifesto.
mm. Um,
Simple testing is better than no testing. I mean,
yeah,
I can read it later on. So I just wanted to tell.
yeah. I just like their documentation. It comes down to that developer experience. I don't know if you've ever used a tool or technology, and you've just had a problem or a question like, how do I do X with said tool? I've done the tutorial, I've gotten started. How do I do the next thing? And sometimes with the other like Selenium tools or Appium, you can spend hours going through looking through stack trace, just trying to find other people who have tried to solve the exact same thing you've done, and it's a real challenge, and it can be really off-putting when you're trying to learn a new technology and you can't find the answers that you need. It's not documented in a easy to use fashion, so that
Mm-hmm.
I think documentation is often an element of quality that is often overlooked in the development
Mm.
process too. Do you have any examples of really good documentation of tools that you've come across?
Um, I think I'm using JMeter, so that has a very fantastic documentation, right? I use Swagger, that has a good documentation. Um, Other than that, I mean, Selenium, as you know, from the API standpoint, right,
Mm,
from their main website, that has a good documentation. Um, when I use Selenium, I take help from like blogs like Elemental Selenium. Uh, that has a newsletter, I guess.
Mm,
I'm not using Selenium for a long time, so not sure. But Elemental Selenium was helpful for me. Yeah, it's already there. Receive a free weekly tip on using Selenium.
mm,
So that was helpful for me. And then based on what tools I'm exploring. So there are some tools which are good in the power of their doing the stuff, right? But may not have that much level of documentation. And there are other tools which may not be that powerful, but they are very good on the documentation, right? So, and I think the idea for these tools is that come to the one fundamental: do you understand the testing, right?
mm.
So do you if you understand the load test, right, then probably you can decide one day, or anyone among us, right, that okay, K6 is better suited in this context, right? JMeter better suited in that context, right? It's not very tool specific thing. If you look at their own load testing manifesto, like simple testing is better than no testing, should be goal oriented. Now, if these concepts are ingrained in ourselves and we know what it means, we know what load testing means, right? We know what kind of load will be on the application incoming. Well, what is the pattern, right? All these things, right? If we know that, if we have a better mental model, if we know how to measure and what to measure, right? Then tool will become a choice, right? For example, you may not be, as you mentioned rightly, that well, JMeter cannot be suited into the CICD context, so better is K6. Yeah, well, go ahead for that. Important thing is, do I know what to load test,
Mm.
how to identify the load, how to talk to the stakeholders, how to get the information from them, right? These are some topics that I will be covering in my coming 2 hours workshop on the testing, right? So that was an eye-opening stuff for me because of certain failures, and my failures was more about sometimes I'm doing deep testing while the shallow testing was required to get the results early for the stakeholders,
Mm.
right? So I mean different aspects in that. But I
If
will also explore this K6 again.
if someone wants to
So
find out more information about this workshop you're running, where should they go? How do they find
more
it?
information with respect to what is there, right? I think it's on the. Just give me 1 second. I have not seen when they published it, to be honest.
Oh,
But let me see. Uh,
is that run through
the test drive.
Test Drive?
Yeah, yeah,
Let's have a look at events.
yep. 1 second.
Oh, there we go. Oh no, that's a virtual meetup on the 12th of Feb.
Yeah, that's yep, yep, yep. That's what you need.
Okay, there we go. So if you enjoyed this session and would like to hear Sandeep nerd out more over how to scope out performance testing, I'm going to do a plug for this event to close things off.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for your time, Sam, and very interesting discussion. And I think I can schedule one another if that is allowed and applicable. I don't know because we had a good conversation, and we can probably next could be on K6 itself. Why don't we do that? What do you think?
I think that sounds great. There's been lots of people that I've paired with and had like an initial discussion, and I'm like, I want to dive deeper in on this topic, and I need to. I think scheduling like a part two, with some people I think would be really interesting. I think once I've gotten through this proof of concept with K6 with my current client, and once
Mhm.
I've got like a decent tutorial on how to get started, that's not on an internal blog, but is now on an external blog, I'll
Mhm.
reach out to you to reschedule a follow up session.
Sure, definitely. And if I did before, for example, because I said I'm just crawling into multiple aspects, right? So if I did something, I'll share it with you, and let's see what comes next.